I still can't look at any pictures of her because it just breaks my heart.
It was May 19th, 2016, and the summit of Everest was just 15 minutes away from Maria Strydom. After 8 years of training, she and her husband were steps from glory, carrying their message that a vegan could go on even the most demanding adventures. They had made their marks on 3 of the world's highest peaks. Everest was next, but in the death zone, one wrong decision can seal your fate forever. This is the story of how a mission to prove a vegan could conquer Everest, the world's highest peak, ended badly. Welcome to the Extreme Edge. On the 9th of April 2016, 12 climbers from all over the world set out on a 7-week expedition led by experienced Dutch mountaineer Arnold Koster, with only one goal in mind: to summit Everest. Among them was Robert Gropel and his wife, Maria Strydom. Maria Strydom was not the kind of woman who ever backed down from a challenge. Born in South Africa, she carried a restless curiosity and loved pushing past the limits others tried to set. As a little girl, numbers fascinated her just as much as the natural landscapes outside her window. By the time she was a grown woman, she had created a respected career for herself as a lecturer in finance, guiding young minds with the same passion she once carried in her own student days. But her love for mountains never stopped. Instead, it grew bigger. She wanted to conquer them and to look down on the world from heights that very few human beings would ever touch. Now, Maria wasn't recklessly in love with mountains. She knew the odds of scaling those giant rocks. It wasn't just about her body. Her mind needed training to survive in places where critical thinking went into every single step. Maria kept training and going on adventures that most people would avoid. Her ambitions bothered her family, especially her mother, who believed they were too dangerous for her little girl. Maybe that's why Maria stayed low, chasing smaller victories while working hard as an academic. But all of this was just the beginning of Maria's story, because if there was anything Maria loved more than mountaineering, it would be her husband, Robert Gropel. When 21-year-old Maria met veterinarian Robert Gropel in 2003, she had just graduated from the University of Pretoria in South Africa and had moved to Australia for work as a lecturer. With so many things in common, it didn't take long before they became life partners. Robert loved the outdoors almost as much as Maria. He longed for that rush of adrenaline and to see the world from the highest points. For Maria, who loved balance, this was her perfect match. I can imagine that they must have felt like 2 peas in a pod. For the next 5 years, they played it safe as mountaineers, doing their jobs and perhaps saving up for their biggest dream. But in 2008, the couple made a shocking announcement. Maria and Robert had decided to take on one of the greatest challenges any mountaineer could imagine. They were going to climb the 7 summits of the world: Everest, Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, Denali, Aconcagua, Mount Vinson, and Puncak Jaya. And if that wasn't a hard enough test of their endurance, the couple added one more challenge. You see, there was one more thing they had in common. Maria and Robert were vegans. Being vegan meant they avoided eating anything that came from animals. Not just that, they also avoided using animal products like leather or wool. But at that time, it was believed that you needed to have animal protein in your meals to have the energy needed to thrive as a climber. Maria and her husband thought that was untrue, and they were determined to prove their point by successfully reaching the 7 summits. Their journey began on the highest mountain on the continent, where Maria was born, Africa's giant Mount Kilimanjaro. It stands at 19,341 feet, and that was a good start to their mission. Even though it's not as high as the rest, Kilimanjaro is a mountain no one should underestimate. When altitude sickness hit, headaches could feel like the beat of ancient drums. Yet, Maria and Robert reached the summit together, standing with pride on the famous Uhuru Peak. They did it, and that was the confidence boost that led them to the next mountain they had their eyes on, Mount Denali. But remember, Everest wasn't just another mountain on their list. What happened up there would push their marriage, their mission, and their very survival to the breaking point. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be part of the Extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. Alaska's Denali is easily one of the deadliest peaks in the world. The weather is unpredictable, and the temperature could fall so low that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. In fact, rescue helicopters sometimes can't even reach rescue points due to how quickly the weather changes. Yet, Maria and Robert made it to the top, and that was enough proof that they were experienced mountaineers. The next challenge was in South America, where the Aconcagua rose from Argentina's desert. It wasn't cold, but it was dry and demanded a different kind of strength than the cold of other mountains. With the sun scorching their backs, this couple rose to the top, exhausted but fulfilled. By the time Maria and Robert arrived at the base camp of the fourth mountain on their list, Mount Everest, in 2016, they were ready for any challenge they would face on their way up. It was May 19th, 2016. Maria and Robert had made their way to Camp 4. It was the last stop before the summit, and everyone knew it. To reach this final camp was already to defeat obstacles that would have broken many. They had already dragged themselves through the Khumbu icefall with its constantly shifting ice towers and fought the winds on the Lhotse face that could tear tents apart. Now at Camp 4, the world outside their tent was nothing but black sky and biting wind. But inside their tent, the couple and their teammates put themselves together. It was time to make the final ascent to Everest's summit. By 9 p.m., the climbers began to stagger out of the tent. One by one, the ropes were clipped, and the long line to the summit began to form. From a distance, it must have looked like a group of fireflies making their way up a frozen sky. Robert adjusted his oxygen mask and looked at Maria. Even though her face was partly hidden under layers of gear, he could see the determination in her eyes. They stepped into the line together, joining their team and the dozens of climbers who had chosen this night to make their attempt. Climbers often describe the summit push on Everest as a battle not only against the mountain, but against the clock. The altitude levels are already against you, but storms could still form without warning. To survive, you had to move carefully and quickly. But Robert's heart must have been racing with anticipation. By his calculations, they were close. So close. 15 minutes and he'd be kissing the love of his life with the entire globe stretching below them. He must have imagined the victorious moment when their arms would be wrapped around each other, with their faces pressed together behind oxygen masks in a happy dance. Except that when he turned to share that excitement with Maria, the smile on his face vanished immediately. Maria was exhausted, and that was not a good sign. At those altitudes, even the smallest weakness can turn fatal. If Maria couldn't match the pace of the team, then everyone could be at risk. In fact, there was no way Maria could continue the climb. The higher up, the harder breathing becomes. If she pressed on, she'd lose her life without a doubt, and her body might remain on the mountain forever. Robert froze, and many thoughts must have gone through his mind at that moment. This is the woman he has summited every mountain with. Now, you might be curious, did he stand at the highest peak without her? Did he consider turning back with her? If he did, was it Maria who reminded him that their goal was to prove to the world that plants are enough to power humans up to the highest mountain? They had always said this climb wasn't just about themselves. It was about the message that you didn't need animal products to be strong, that you could thrive on plants alone and still face down the tallest mountains on Earth. And if they could put a vegan flag on Everest, the world would have to notice. Around them, climbers moved on. Some glanced back with sympathy, while others were too focused on their own survival to stop. But only Robert carried the load of the choice he had to make. And as he looked at his wife, he knew what she wanted him to do. She gave him a small gesture as if to say, "Go on, prove it, show them." Even through her exhaustion, Robert could see what she meant. But Robert hesitated. He wanted to stay with her, to turn back right then, to forget the summit. Yet Maria's eyes held that same determination he had seen so many times before on other mountains. And now, she was asking him to finish what they started. Robert sighed, and then, with every muscle in his body screaming not to, he unclipped and stepped into the upward line. He was even more determined to make it to the summit and back to his wife in time. It must have been after Robert moved away that the reality of her loneliness hit Maria. I wonder what she did for hours as she waited for Robert to come back. Maybe she tried to focus on her breath, but deep inhaling in Camp 4 would have felt like claws at her lungs. After a few hours, her thoughts would have begun to slip sideways, going from fear to confusion as the fog of oxygen deprivation settled in. Still, her mind returned again and again to Robert. Was he okay up there? Was he moving fast enough? Was he safe crossing the Hillary Step? She pictured him reaching the summit, holding up their flag, and for a moment, she smiled under her mask. That was what they had dreamed of, wasn't it? To show the world what they believed in, to stand there, together, or at least one for the other. But as the hours stretched, she began to worry again. What if he didn't come back? What if she had sent him to his death? The guilt pressed harder than the cold. Her own body was shutting down. She could feel it in the way her legs trembled and her eyelids fought to stay open. Yet her heart raced more for him than for herself. Can you imagine being in a life or death situation, but instead all you can think of is your partner? She wasn't sure which frightened her more, the thought of collapsing here alone, or the thought of Robert never reappearing from the glowing line of climbers above. She hugged her arms around herself, tried to stay still. Somewhere, deep inside, a whisper urged her to stand, to follow, to do anything but wait. All she could do was keep her place on the mountain, anchored in cold and silence, praying that the man she loved would return before it was too late. Robert's climb from there was a mix of agony and awe. The ridge narrowed until the world fell away on both sides, nothing but black void under the stars. The Hillary Step, once a vertical rock face, now partly collapsed by earthquake, still demanded precision and nerve. With a pounding heart and eyes half shut against the icy wind, Robert fought his way over it, and then, at last, the ground leveled. He was there, the top of the world. You might think the summit of Everest is some grand stage climbers could camp on. Well, no. Everest's summit is just a small crest, with barely enough room for a handful of people at once. But standing there, you would see the earth curved away in every direction. You'd see the Himalayas stretched like a frozen ocean, and the village below would look like grains. That's when the glory hits. For a moment, Robert forgot all the pain and weakness he was feeling. He even forgot about the thinness of the air. He was standing on the highest point on Earth, and Maria was the reason he had made it. With trembling hands, he held up a green flag marked with the word vegan as cameras flashed at him. His teammates celebrated and hugged each other, but for Robert, victory felt incomplete without his beloved wife. However, the summit is only halfway. Getting back down safely is just as demanding. By the time Robert began his descent, the sun was rising. If he had paused to look around, he would have seen how beautiful the world was from up there, but all he could think of was Maria waiting below. I try to imagine the kind of thoughts he was having. Did it cross his mind that she might not survive? Did he hope that she would regain her strength and be on her way up as well? If he thought so, then his heart must have broken with every step he took with no Maria in sight. His health was failing, and from his symptoms, Robert knew he had developed high-altitude sickness, but all he could think of was the woman waiting for him just below. Minutes must have felt like hours, and when Robert finally saw the hunched posture of his wife right where he left her, his heart forgot how to beat. With mustered courage, Robert called out to Maria, hoping for even the faintest response. When he heard nothing, he mentally prepared himself for the worst and moved closer. Maria's eyelids flickered. She was alive, but something was wrong with Maria's lips. They were blue, and her eyes struggled to focus. This wasn't exhaustion. This was something much more dangerous. Maria had developed high-altitude sickness. While Robert was making his way to the summit, Maria was slipping deeper into danger. Can you imagine the guilt Robert must have felt for not insisting on the descent? Robert decided he was going to do all he could to save Maria. First, he adjusted her mask and checked the oxygen flow. Empty. The cylinder had run dry. Who knew how long it had been like that? Still, he had to try, so he brought out a spare tank and pressed it against her mask, hoping that would be enough. For a moment, her chest rose deeper, like she could finally breathe. She stirred, and Robert had probably never rejoiced the way he did in that moment. But the sickness had affected her too deeply. Her body sagged again, head dropping forward. Robert pulled her up and held her against him. He must have felt his own strength bleeding away and his muscles rebelling after the summit. But none of that mattered. He couldn't and he wouldn't leave her. His mind raced for options. How could he save her life? Then he remembered. There was one thing left: the injection. Deep in his pack was a dose of dexamethasone, sealed in a small case. It's a steroid used by high-altitude climbers to fight cerebral edema, that is, the swelling of the brain caused by lack of oxygen. They had packed it for emergencies, as a last resort they hoped never to use. Now, looking at Maria's slack body, Robert knew it was their only chance. But it was his chance too. He could use it on himself, he needed it badly. But when he looked at Maria, shivering, unable to even stand, his decision was already made. He chose her. His hands shook as he slipped the needle into her arm, pressing down the plunger. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then, like a miracle, her eyes flickered open, and this time, she whispered his name. In that moment, Robert's heart must have soared higher than the peak he just ascended. As soon as she could move, Maria leaned on him as he tried to guide her along the rope. Robert was getting his wife home no matter what. Do you think Robert talked to her as they made their way down? Maybe he told her about the view from the summit, or about how he struggled up the Hillary step. Maybe he told her that he made her proud, or that they had to pause their mission for a while. At one point, she looked at him with eyes full of gratitude, or maybe goodbye. I wonder if Robert knew what her look meant and begged her to stay with him. But it didn't matter anymore. The injection had only bought them more time. Maria's breathing turned shallow until she collapsed again in his arms. Robert shook her, screamed her name, but she didn't answer. Her chest stopped moving, and Robert's world turned upside down. It was the 20th of May, 2016, and 34-year-old Maria Strydom had passed away in her husband's arms. I wonder what was going through her mind in those last moments. At what point did she know her life was going to end on that mountain? Did she find some peace in the fact that she didn't die alone, that she at least died in the arms of the love of her life? For a long time, Robert couldn't move. The summit meant nothing now. All that mattered was holding her as if his warmth could bring her back. But the longer he stayed, the worse his health got. Carrying her body was not an option, so Robert had to do what he called the hardest thing ever. He had to leave her body behind on the mountain that had claimed her, but not without promising never to return home unless he took her body with him, a promise he made sure to fulfill. This story is heartbreaking because Maria and Robert were not reckless climbers. They were experienced and had turned back from other mountains many times before when conditions weren't right. They knew the risks better than most, and still they chose to face them together. Maria had set out to prove a point to the world that strength and endurance could thrive on a vegan life. She had already proven it on several continents, and Everest was meant to be another milestone in her ultimate dream. Instead, it became the place where her journey ended. It's tragic how her life was cut short at just 34, and how Robert returned home without the woman who had shared not only his climbs, but also his heart. But in their years together, their love remained undeniable. Maria's story is not only about mountains, but about love, courage, and the risks we take when we chase our dreams. She may not have made it home from Everest, but the devotion she shared with Robert and the determination she carried to prove that strength could thrive on a vegan life will always be remembered. In the end, her journey reminds us that what matters most isn't reaching the summit, it's the love and purpose we carry with us along the way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.